Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 18763 in the name of Fiona Hislop on 20 years of Scotland's railway providing a strong platform for the future. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I call on Fiona Hislop to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, around 13 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name. Scotland's public transport system provides a cleaner and greener alternative to the private car and is a key enabler for growth and opportunity. And it provides vital links for people to live, learn, earn and socialise. And Scotland's railway is at the forefront of this. The railway supports vital connections between our cities, our communities, our businesses and showcases much of what Scotland has to offer. And the railway is an integral part of our nation's economy and well-being, and I pay tribute to all the people who work on our railway. 2025 marks 20 years since rail powers were devolved at executive level to the Scottish Government, and this was a significant step in devolution and a key milestone which helped us deliver the success which is Scotland's railway. And as the UK Rail Minister, Lord Hendy, has said, Scotland's integrated approach, which is underpinned by the alliance between ScotRail and Network Rail, has delivered a more cohesive railway system, one that has been delivered through the greater integration of the management of track and train working together as a whole system. Now, today is an important moment to reflect on the achievements delivered by Scotland's Railway on behalf of the people of Scotland. And going forward, our focus remains on delivering further improvements to encourage more people to switch from their car and to choose more sustainable journeys. And by making rail services more affordable, accessible and inclusive, we are delivering on the core principles of our national transport strategy. Willie Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
While the Cabinet Secretary is on to improvements, can she give us an update on when she plans to give some positive news about the new rail development, new railway station at Newborough? She had a very good visit to Newborough some months ago, and she was supposed to be receiving advice towards the end of May. We're just very keen to hear a positive news about the next steps.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I did indeed have a very good visit to Newborough and heard the passion of the community there. I've made clear to my officials that I would like their advice as soon as possible. I understand the work is ongoing and obviously has been supported with government funding to help get it to this stage, but I'm expecting that advice fairly soon. So, since 2007, this government has invested over £12 billion in rail infrastructure. Our consistent policy of maintaining a rolling programme of electrification has delivered 574 kilometres of electrified track, enabling greener and more efficient journeys. And over the past 20 years, the Scottish Executive then and Government now has funded the construction of 25 new stations across Scotland and reopened 4 previously disused lines, reconnecting communities across Scotland. These projects don't just improve infrastructure, they improve lives. And I do recognise that going back over the last 20 years, a number of valued improvements to our railway were initiated by previous administrations, which we inherited in 2007 and successfully delivered. Airdrie to Bathgate and Stirling, Dunblane and Alloa have connected communities across the Central Belt. And of course, the Edinburgh to Glasgow Improvements Programme has delivered not only modern electric trains, but the impressive transformation of Haymarket and Glasgow Queen Street stations on this flagship route. Indeed.
Sue Webber.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you, Presiding Officer. The east-west lines that you discussed there briefly, Cabinet Secretary, I was wondering if you'd comment on perhaps the need for the Amon Cord to really vitalise and bring back to life that lemming of a station of Edinburgh Gateway that is largely unused.
Always through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
So we recognise the previous work on Egypt and the recommendations of the Amon Cord. There are ongoing electrification taking place, particularly the Haymarket to Dalmeny, and I saw that in person when I travelled last Friday to Fife to announce the electrification in the Fife area. Now, this week we celebrate 10 years since the Borders Railway line reopened, and it had been closed for nearly 50 years. The Borders reopening has transformed the economy and attractiveness of the local area and improved lives. Last year, we opened the Leavenmouth rail link, with Leven and Cameron Bridge and their active travel network finally reconnected to Scotland's rail network with direct services to Edinburgh via Kirkcaldy. And in May, the ScotRail introduced a second train each hour via Dunfermline and the wider Fife network, providing additional journey opportunities. And I know during this debate we will hear ambitious calls for more stations, as we already have, on more lines, but I doubt I'll be able to address them all in my closing, but I will try to. And it has now been, if I can move on just now, it's now been 3 years since the Scottish Government took the decision to end the Abellio ScotRail franchise and 2 years since the Serco Caledonian Sleeper franchise. Both operators are now in public ownership and under the direction of Scottish Rail Holdings, and we've seen continued improvements as a result of public ownership. ScotRail has added more than 200 additional services each weekday in the last year, offering 7% more seats. ScotRail has a proven track record in boosting patronage, with journeys in financial year 24-25 at 84.7 million, up from 63.7 million in 22-23 and up from 81.1 million in 23-24, and that's a huge increase of 33% over 2 years, and a healthy increase of 4% between 23-24 and 24-25. And on average, ScotRail remains one of the highest scoring operators in terms of overall passenger satisfaction. ScotRail employs 900 more people than prior to public ownership, and for the 5th year in a row has been awarded top employer status. And I want personally to congratulate all ScotRail staff for their hard work and dedication. And under public ownership of Caledonian Sleepers, performance has improved. Right time arrivals are at almost 88%, well above the average across the rest of the UK. The sleeper passenger numbers continue to grow year on year, and one of the strongest post-pandemic recoveries across all GB operators. And on rail reform, the UK Government is preparing to legislate in this area. And this Government believes that a fully devolved and an integrated railway, publicly controlled and operated in the service of the public and truly accountable to them, will deliver better and more efficient services for our people, our communities and our visitors. However, in the absence of full devolution, I have made clear to the UK Government that Scotland must benefit from rail reform to the same extent as England and Wales, and have welcomed assurances from the UK Minister for Rail, Lord Hendy, in that regard, but have yet to see if and how that will be secured in law. Now, I've made it clear in...
Jamie Green.
If the Cabinet Secretary has time, I'll very briefly intervene and say, with devolution comes fiscal responsibility. The cost of upgrading the tracks and the operation of the Network Rail operations is huge. Where will the Government find the money if they want to take over that responsibility?
Cabinet Secretary.
So we already fund the network responsibilities, £1.5 billion. That's part of CP7. That's part already of our budget. The issue we have to ensure in rail reform is not only do we have control of the funding, but we also have the decision-making. And that's my concern about the rail reform that is currently being discussed at UK level, that vertical integration might preclude what we already have in terms of governance arrangements. So I have made it clear in meetings with the UK Government that the Scottish Ministers will not accept any diminution of our existing devolved powers over rail, and that strong governance, accountability and assurance measures must be in place for those areas which we set strategy, fund and specify. And that is why a collective stance from this Parliament stating this is important at this time. Now, moving to the economy, we know rail also benefits business and growth through rail freight, and transporting goods by rail is a key lever to drive down transport emissions. And the role of government is to put policies in place that facilitate modal shift, and we've shown genuine leadership with a tangible focus in this area, with our first-of-a-kind freight growth targets incentivising Network Rail to collaborate with the industry to grow rail freight. But freight works on a commercial basis, so there's a key role for the industry to play here. And in these times of constrained budgets, I am proud of our investment in projects that support rail freight, and pleased to have secured rail freight grant in this year's budget. And as we work with the rail industry to plan the next suite of investment projects, we will continue to ensure that the benefit for freight is maximised. Now, very briefly,
Paul Sweeney, briefly.
The Minister also recognised the importance of rail maintenance and rolling stock maintenance in Scotland, and particularly welcome the reopening of the Calais Railway Works in Springburn after a 6-year hiatus by Gibson's Engineering, and hope that they succeed in building more contracts after the recent award of the Transport for London contract.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I do welcome that, and I think part of the role in the economy is to help the supply chain, and I think it's really important that in terms of those jobs and investment that they continued and welcome continued investment by the Scottish Government help support that supply chain. So despite the well-known financial challenges, this year the Scottish Government will invest over £1.5 billion in both ScotRail and Sleeper services and in operating and maintaining and renewing the rail network. And while transport is a significant contributor of greenhouse gases emissions, Scotland's Railway is a success story. Whether diesel or electric traction, it is already a very low-carbon form of transport for passengers and freight. So Scotland's Railway will make a significant contribution to the Scottish Government's wider net zero commitments, and will set this out in our draft climate change plan that we put before Parliament. Looking forward, we continue to invest to modernise Scotland's Railway. Over 75% of passenger journeys are already made on electric traction, and building on our record of delivery of electrification from last year, railway passengers enjoyed new electric services on the Glasgow to Barrhead line, which completed in December 2023. This year, we're delivering works to electrify the railway line between Dalmeny and Haymarket, completing the £144 million East Kilbride enhancement project. And just last week, funding was announced to electrify key routes on the Fife and Borders line, delivering modern, reliable trains. And these infrastructure enhancements are enabling works that will allow a new zero-emission fleet to be introduced. And in autumn, we will publish a refresh of the Rail Decarbonisation Action Plan, setting out a credible plan to deliver decarbonisation in a proportionate way that achieves best value. And Scotland's Railway must capitalise on its existing skills and identify and create opportunities to upskill the current workforce, retraining individuals from other sectors and investing time in the future workforce, future-proofing Scotland's Railway. And the Rail Cluster Builder is a specific example of the Scottish Government's support of the rail industry. Funded by Scottish Enterprise, Transport Scotland and Skills Development Scotland, the Rail Cluster is a 3-year project connecting more Scottish SMEs with rail sector organisations, strengthening and deepening relationships with key stakeholders across the sector, and helping to create innovation, green solutions that will support our net zero targets. And ScotRail has an ageing fleet of trains which must be replaced over the coming decade. A procurement exercise to replace ScotRail's intercity high-speed train fleet is already underway, and last month we formally started market engagement with train manufacturers on the suburban train fleet. And the trains will enable level boarding, will be more energy efficient, helping to reduce emissions and operating costs, and will meet better, modern passenger expectations better. And we want more people to choose to travel by public transport for work, for study and leisure. And that is why ScotRail peak fares have gone, and gone for good. And this will help people with ongoing household bills and costs. Existing rail passengers will save money, and it will encourage new potential passengers onto the train and to leave the car at home. Permanently removing ScotRail peak fares makes public transport a more affordable option for many. It makes ticketing simpler and more straightforward, supporting our ambitions to simplify ticketing across our transport network. Presiding Officer, I have made clear the importance of Scotland's railway to our economy and society. I have made clear the commitment the Scottish Government has made over many years to deliver a wide range of achievements. These make a real difference to people's lives, and our commitment to rail moving forward remains as strong. And as we mark 20 years of devolution in Scotland's railway, I commend this motion to this Parliament.
Thank you very much. I now call on Sue Webber to speak to move Amendment 18763.1. Around 9 minutes, Ms Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name. And I think we can all agree upon the importance of rail to Scottish economy and Scottish business, such as in the transportation of whisky and fresh produce, as well as the importance of rail to the future decarbonisation of transport. And it also plays a key role in Scotland's social development. Our railways have been long been a backbone of our communities, linking people to work, education and leisure, while offering a critical environmental alternative to car travel. But rather than simply celebrating past achievements, the Scottish Conservative Amendment today calls for a forward-looking strategy that ensures the needs of the public and the wider economy are met. It is vital that the Scottish Government ensures that value for money and passenger satisfaction remains at the forefront of railway delivery in Scotland. And the SNP promised an improved ScotRail when they nationalised the rail service over 3 years ago. Yet under the SNP, public transport has become unreliable and far too expensive. Ticket prices and complaints have soared, whilst the number of services and passengers have plummeted. Indeed, there is not a single mention in the Scottish Government motion of the stark fact that our rail service have never quite got back to offering anything like the same level of service as they did pre-COVID. And this is one of the... not quite at this moment, Cabinet Secretary. And this is one of the reasons so many people are reluctant to get back to office working. And with that decision comes a direct correlation with the recovery of our towns and city centre economies. The SNP's decision to reintroduce peak fares across ScotRail trains last year was a disastrous decision that served to punish hard-working Scots, especially those businesses and employees that were just considering returning to work to kick-start their business performance and increase productivity. We campaigned against this, and despite the SNP being defeated on a Scottish Conservative vote on this last summer, almost a year to the day, the SNP did refuse to budge. And they claimed at the time that abolishing peak fares permanently was unaffordable. And maybe I'm far too cynical, but it came to the timing of the U-turn. It didn't really come as a surprise to me. Desperate for good news story and desperate to take full credit, we have seen this modus operandi before from the SNP. But I am thrilled that with the SNP's latest U-turn because it's been long overdue. And we have always said that the Scottish Conservatives would permanently scrap those peak rail fares to ease the burden on hard-working Scots. But it's also today about improving rail connections throughout Scotland, and it's not just about a regional benefit but a national priority. We need to enhance the infrastructure to not only foster local community cohesion but also bolster the entire country's transport network. But passengers have been let down by the SNP's mismanagement. It's common sense to link new railway developments to future centres of population growth. And the SNP government must outline how it plans to link the railway with growing towns and villages across the country, those that lack that rail link. Yes, please. Yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I note the terms of the motion. Does she reflect that her motion, had it been the policy in the past, would have actually prevented the Borders Railway because actually it was introduced because of declining population, and indeed the terms of her motion may indeed undermine those that are campaigning for the extension of the Borders Railway?
Sue Webber.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. This is part and parcel of today. The motion the SNP have laid us today is looking back. I want to look forward and look to the future. And Winchborough is a perfect example of a place that would benefit from a train station. And it's something I've been pushing for in this Parliament for some years now. It's a vibrant, growing community in West Lothian, and it desperately needs connection to that rail network. The establishment of a new railway station would enhance connectivity, ease traffic congestion in West Lothian and the west of Edinburgh, and supports many ambitions to provide sustainable transport solutions. There's going to be 4,000 new families living there, and they need that connection. A new station in Winchborough is essential. It's also a necessity to alleviate mounting congestion, but critical in meeting the Scottish Government's failing net zero ambitions. So too would investment in the Amman Cord, because if the investment was made there, it would make that £41 million investment in Edinburgh Gateway look less of a white elephant. Connecting services from Fife to the west of Scotland, with all of the new houses being built in West Edinburgh, I know commuters are crying out for this to be considered. But there is no future plan today. We're celebrating stations that have come into service. There's no details of what stations will come in the future. Blindwells in East Lothian will see 10,000 new homes, and despite the East Coast Main Line running through this stretch of an ever-expanding commuter area, there are only one train per hour. The homes are being touted as commutable to Edinburgh, but it seems going by car will be far more preferential than taking the train. Residents are buying homes there because of the easy reach to Edinburgh for social and leisure activities, but they're going to have to drive. We need to help these people make the decisions to use public transport. And the Scottish Government motion today makes no mention at all of new rail building in these vital new communities and homes. We get dire warnings instead about threats to Scottish ministers' powers. Cabinet Secretary, perhaps in closing you might be able to outline what will be done to accelerate badly needed investment in our rail infrastructure instead of the customary foot-dragging which slows up so many practical and cost-effective schemes like Winchborough and the Amman Cord. Because we also need, investment in that train fleet, because we have an ageing fleet and our assets are needing some renewal. The future development of our railway is currently hindered by that ageing 19th century infrastructure, and we can't hide about that. That's fact. And we have an ageing ScotRail fleet. Joanne Maguire, the Director of ScotRail, has previously said, "We've got another challenge on our hands with an ageing fleet. We have one of the oldest fleets in Britain. On key intercity routes, the reliability of the Intercity 125 fleet has been a persistent disappointment, leading to overcrowding and service disruptions. And in rural lines, they face equally significant challenges. Iconic routes like the West Highland and Far North lines remain plagued by outdated infrastructure and limited amenities, despite our very scenic railways holding immense untapped potential. The Scottish Government is committed to spending in excess of £6 billion on new road capacity on corridors from Perth and Aberdeen to Inverness. Yet no similar ambition exists for parallel rail routes. The Highland Main Line has been left with infrastructure that Victorians would recognise, while an Aberdeen City deal promised that £200 million would be spent on faster line speeds north of Dundee has been reneged upon. And it's vital that the SNP today outline their needs for how they plan to future-proof the rail network. Because we've also heard as well about the importance of supply chain and from organisations that are really concerned about the boom and bust in the investment cycles. Because the sector really faces uncertainty due to that cyclical nature of rail infrastructure spending, the booms and the busts. And they want to see a consistent long-term plan so they can invest in this country with their businesses. That instability, as I said, hinders long-term planning and really discourages new talent from entering the industry. I've also heard about how skills shortages are an issue and workforce retention is a challenge. There's a notable portion of the rail workforce, especially among supplier firms, that have exited the industry, 9.4% in the last year alone. And this is leading to a critical loss of expertise. So without that steady pipeline of projects, companies are struggling to invest in the staff training and recruitment that is needed. The Cabinet Secretary in her remarks also spoke about the crucial nature of rail freight growth, and it is a strategic priority. However, rail faces cost competitiveness challenges compared to road transport, especially since a key freight support grant for 2024-25 has been abolished. Capacity constraints across critical routes, especially cross-border and internal, are hampering freight growth. And the asset renewal, again, in addition to just the trains themselves, there is significant inflation costs to contend with, and the supply chain disruptions are challenging also. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, as I've just clocked the time, we need to focus on putting passengers first and cutting waste with bloated quangos, tightening spending rules and focusing every penny on delivering a safe, reliable and modern railway, a railway that delivers value for money for taxpayers, commuters, the business and economy. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Webber. I now call on Claire Baker to speak to and move Amendment 18763.3. Around 7 minutes. Ms Baker.
Thank you, President Officer. I am pleased to open this debate this afternoon for Scottish Labour, marking 20 years since the devolution of rail powers and recognising the progress that has been made on Scotland's railways. The motion highlights some achievements over that time, including the reopening of Levenmouth Rail Link, which is close to my own heart since 2008. The reopening was a result of the perseverance of a tenacious group of campaigners alongside a strong cross-party support. It is an example of what can be achieved when communities and campaigners work together. But we must also acknowledge that it should not take decades of pressure to deliver essential transport connections. Communities in other parts of Scotland are still waiting for investment and deserve clarity on when promised projects will actually be delivered. As we reflect on the progress, we must also be honest about the challenges that our rail network faces and the work that still needs to be done. While we may accept that the coming together of the rail bodies involved in Scotland's railway has been a success, the running of our railways by the Scottish Government has not maximised the potential that exists, and improving that is where the focus should be. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the return of ScotRail to public ownership. This is a policy that Scottish Labour had long called for. Public ownership provides the opportunity for greater accountability and a service that puts passengers and workers ahead of profit. But it must deliver reliability, better affordability and better accessibility. It must mean that passengers see a difference in the quality of service, and it must also mean that staff feel supported and safe at work. The motion references an increase in ScotRail passenger numbers of a fifth, but we know that passenger numbers are still 20% lower than pre-pandemic. One of the first actions of the Scottish Government when they took control of ScotRail was the cutting of services, rather than investing in demand that would align with the aims of reducing car use and emissions. The motion also highlights operational performance and passenger satisfaction under public ownership and control, yet millions has been paid out in compensation under the Delay Repay scheme since nationalisation. And punctuality and reliability are the highest complaint topics. Addressing these issues is core to improving the commuter experience. Briefly.
Cabinet Secretary.
Would she acknowledge that obviously COVID did have a disruption for all rail operators, and ScotRail is one of the fastest growing operators in terms of passenger numbers and also in terms of satisfaction rates? It went up to 90% in the latest survey. So yes, there are issues, and some of those issues around cancellations are to do with the network issues and are a tiny percent of the overall numbers. So there's more improvement to be made, but we should not recognise the improvements over the last few years.
Claire Baker.
Say that I recognise successes and that I believe that taking ScotRail into public ownership is the right thing to do and has been a success. But I think there's more that could be done. And when I speak to constituents in my region, these figures don't really reflect their experience of using the train. And I think if I was to have a discussion with them around the government's very positive spin on what's happening, that's not the daily experience of, and it might be that she's well familiar with Fife Circle, it might be particular to Fife, but it's not the daily experience of my constituents. Scottish Labour welcomed the permanent removal of peak fares, but let us be clear, this only happened after significant pressure from trade unions and opposition parties. Just last week, many of us spoke in the members' business debate on this subject, and I have to say I did enjoy quoting some of the Scottish Government's shifting reasons for ending the pilot. But behind that, there are serious questions about the policy intention. Is the permanent removal of peak fares, as the First Minister said, about the cost of living and a policy that the Scottish Government is prepared to finance long-term in order to deliver those savings for passengers? Or is it about achieving modal shift and increasing passenger numbers so that the policy will ultimately play for itself? If it is the latter, how will the Government achieve this and in what timescales, given this was their stated reason for the failure of the pilot? We should also note that not all passengers will be better off. Those who relied on super off-peak tickets may now pay more, and while flexi-passes remain, the percentage savings have fallen. There is scope for a fairer, smarter approach to ticketing, one that reflects post-pandemic travel patterns and addresses regional price disparities that penalise some commuters. Alongside my colleagues, I have consistently pressed the Scottish Government to address unfair ticket prices and poor service reliability, both of which have discouraged people from choosing rail. If we're serious about tackling the climate emergency of reducing congestion on our roads, we need a rail network that people can afford to use and rely on. Encouraging more people to travel by train supports our local economies, reduces emissions and helps create more vibrant town centres by making it easier for people to travel for work and leisure. The Cabinet Secretary is well aware, as I've already mentioned, of the persistent problems for rail passengers in my region of Mid-Scotland and Fife, allowing reliability and overcrowding. A recurring problem is the use of short forming on peak time services in order to plug gaps elsewhere, but this leaves Fife travellers either in packed carriages or unable to board trains at all. I welcome confirmation of electrification work on parts of the Fife and Borders routes, but there needs to be a degree of honesty about what this will mean for passengers. Many stations will see little change for years. Improvements in reliability and capacity cannot wait until the end of electrification projects. When it comes to short forming in particular, I would urge the Scottish Government to explore more consistent and public tracking of this in addition to the existing PPM measures as a basis for working swiftly to reduce it as far as possible and to help build passenger confidence. The Labour amendment urges a focus on service improvement alongside passenger experience and worker safety. Across our public transport, we need to ensure that passengers and staff are safe in their work and travel and that they are protected from violence and abuse. We know that changes in ticket office hours have meant less visible staff around some stations, and we have to make sure this doesn't mean that people, particularly women and girls, feel less safe when travelling. Finally, when it comes to the UK Government's plan for rail reform, there have been assurances that these will not affect Scottish Powers, and we should take those assurances seriously. We know that improvements to cross-border services will benefit Scotland, and the focus of the Scottish Government should be on providing the best service for passengers. As we mark 20 years of devolved rail powers, we should celebrate achievements, but we must not be complacent. The real test of Scotland's railways is in the daily experience of passengers and workers, and that is why we should focus on driving up punctuality and reliability, delivering modal shift by making rail affordable, reliable and accessible, protecting workers from violence and abuse, and ensuring that public ownership works for the public by delivering a service that people can trust. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Baker. Just to advise the Chamber, we have exhausted all the time we had in hand. I call Mark Ruskell up to 6 minutes. Mr Ruskell.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Scottish Government for giving us the opportunity today to acknowledge the progress made in the devolution era to restore our railways and to run them in the public interest. And I think it's a very timely debate coming just 1 week after peak fares were finally scrapped for good. This debate is also an opportunity to look forward to the kind of railway that everybody in Scotland wants to feel proud of, a railway that is genuinely affordable, safe and accessible, low carbon and pollution free, a reliable service that is welcoming and comfortable, a railway which reaches out to many of the communities who were abandoned following the beaching cuts and need to be connected once again. There is so much to be said about our railways, but let me start with where we left off last week. The scrapping of peak fares is what people want. They don't want complex, overpriced ticketing where you have to sprint to the ticket barriers to get the last off-peak train. The days of making rail exclusive and only for the few is coming to an end, but we need to go further. Research from Scottish Greens shows that the vast majority of ScotRail's first-class ticket capacity is going unused. Last year, 98% of first-class tickets were unsold. And of course, our railways should be for all of us. Every journey on a ScotRail service should be a first-class experience. It shouldn't be determined by your ability to pay extra. Now, we've all been in the situation where we struggle to find seats or are forced to stand in cramped carriages, only for first class to be almost completely empty. Anyone who's got on a busy commuter train from Glasgow to Edinburgh during the festivals in August knows this can be particularly uncomfortable in the heat and can lead to people actually feeling quite unwell. Now, rail companies across the UK are reducing their first-class services, and it is time for ScotRail to do the same. If we're to have a rail renaissance in Scotland, we need low-cost, reliable and accessible rail. Yes.
Is the member aware that ScotRail has already declassified its first-class carriages on most commuter routes? For example, services between Dunblane and Edinburgh Waverley, Alloa and Glasgow Queen Street, Edinburgh Waverley, Glasgow Central Via, Shotts, Fife and the Borders all operate with trains that have first-class seats but no first-class fares, meaning any customer is free to sit there. Perhaps he, like I have done in the past, would encourage people to use those empty seats.
Mark Ruskell.
I'm very much aware of that because I quite regularly sit in those seats when I'm travelling from Stirling. But the reality is that on some of the busiest routes, Cabinet Secretary, we still have a nonsensical first class. So I think it is time to look at this again. But of course, an affordable quality rail service is only of use if you have a station to actually board the train. And many stations that were abandoned in the beaching era are gone and they're not coming back, but there's still other places which are within reach of Scotland's rail network and would benefit from being reconnected. So take Newborough, where I was very pleased to join the Cabinet Secretary on a recent cross-party visit that I helped the community to host. People in Newborough have for decades seen train after train go past on the way to Perth and Edinburgh. Children at local school who dreamed of the railway coming back have now grown up. But the town is set for major housing growth and the community has its sights set on exciting new opportunities, including using the railway and the River Tay together for new eco-tourism business. There is a slot in the current railway timetable for a Newborough rail halt with a low-cost modular station, and that outlay could be recouped easily through increased passenger numbers. But Newborough is not alone, and the demand for more stations is growing. And I have been pleased to support over the years 4 rail campaigns in Fife. One, Levenmouth, has now been built. Newborough, I hope, is on the cusp of a positive decision, while St Andrews and Dunfermline to Alloa are waiting for the right moment to progress. But across Scotland, from the north east to the borders, communities are developing business cases for new stations. They're building the vision of Scotland's railways from the bottom up, and they do need our support. Now, listening to the workers who run our railways is just as important as listening to the communities they serve. And ASLEF's most recent report into the financing of rolling stock reminds us that the job of nationalisation and delivery of a people's railway is not yet complete. Around a quarter of the cost of every rail ticket goes to service rolling stock companies who pay dividends to private shareholders. By issuing government bonds tied to investing proceeds back into rail services, governments could create a virtuous cycle of investment and reinvestment in a public rail service that we all value and want to see grow and develop. ASLEF believe that moving to a public financing model could make 40% savings on rolling stock costs, and it's the approach that most of the rest of the world uses to procure new trains. It's quite clear the privatised model has been disastrous. Levels of investment have been far lower than expected, and additional PFIs have been needed to top up investment. Perverse incentives to scrap new electric trains while running older diesel fleets into the ground have been created across the UK. And all the while, money is leaking out of the system to foreign owners, while we then worry about whether the Scottish Government can justify the relatively small sums to help ScotRail scrap peak rail fares. Presiding officer, we should be proud of ScotRail, but we should also be listening to passengers, communities and unions about their vision for the next 20 years. A people's railway for everyone.
Thank you. I now call Jamie Green. Up to 6 minutes. Mr Green.
I must say I was rather surprised when I saw that the government had pencilled in a debate on railways in government time. It's about time, because we've had many a debate over the years about Scotland's railway. It's really good to see them actively promoting their own U-turns in this regard, because I think when it comes to the removal of peak fares, a little bit of honesty would be much appreciated. Because the government ended that pilot scheme claiming that it was unaffordable. Just over a year ago, the Cabinet Secretary stood in this very place and said that this level of subsidy cannot continue in the current financial climate. I get that. In fact, I distinctly remember the Cabinet Secretary appearing before the Public Audit Committee defending the reinstatement of peak fares. She told us at the time, I quote, "Since the pilot ended, rail use has increased," as some sort of rationale for the removal of what was regarded as a subsidy. Of course, that was just in April, 5 months ago. Now, the government did say at the time that they would consider removing peak fares, I quote, "should UK budget allocations improve in future years." So I am over the moon that the Scottish Government finds itself in that improved financial position and was able to remove peak fares. The problem is, though, they should never really have been taken away in the first place and then brought back and then taken away again, because the economics of this point to one reality. If the price of the train tickets have come down, which is welcome, I believe there's cross-party support for that, but presumably the cost to operate those services has not. So I ask the question, where else in the transport budget has this money come from to be able to reduce these peak fares? Because it seemed counterintuitive to me that the Scottish Government had a target to reduce car usage by 20% by 2030, a target that it has dropped, I should add, but at the same time made train tickets more expensive. Now, that target was important to the Scottish Government because it was important to its other goal of cutting our greenhouse gas emissions by 3/4 by 2030. That also has been dropped. And I mention these climate targets for one reason, because the Scottish Government had a third target, and that was the decarbonisation of all passenger trains by 2035. That's been pushed back by a decade as well. Now, we're still waiting on this refreshed Rail Decarbonisation Action Plan, which was supposed to be published in the spring of this year, We're now in September, and we're yet to see it. Yet here we are having a debate about the future of Scotland's rail. Now, I mention that because I think that a rail decarbonisation plan cannot sit in a silo. I think it must be part of a wider transport decarbonisation strategy and a wider energy strategy. Why? Because I believe that if there is a central government strategy around these things, it will do two things. One is it will create economies of scale when it comes to infrastructure investment in new green technology, but it will also unlock private investment. Now, we've heard a little bit about the role that the private sector plays in this new so-called publicly owned rail service, but the reality is it is the private sector that manufactures the rolling stock. It is the private sector which supplies the financing and leasing, funding arrangements to government for pretty much all of its rolling stock. It is the private sector that does the maintenance on the rolling stock and the midlife overhauls. So really, if there is a strategy on things like hydrogen or battery storage and so on, then part and parcel of that should be a strategy for the whole of the transport sector that could unlock that investment in these technologies. I agree that we should be celebrating 20-year of railway devolution. And I have no ideological opposition to the way that the model currently works. We all know the issues that the last operator had. But, as others have pointed out, there were 17,000 ScotRail cancellations last year. Passenger journey numbers are still lower than pre-pandemic levels, and indeed pre-nationalisation levels as well. And according to the ORR, Scotland was one of only 2 train operators across the whole of the UK to be operating less trains in 2024 than it was in 2023. Of course, the cost of this nationalisation must be talked about. It's not a negative to point out that, according to the Herald, that is, the cost of this has been £1.47 billion, which is a rise of 60% from the 2 years when Abellio operated the franchise. I haven't really got much time, unfortunately, because actually Abellio posted a £65 million loss in that year just before COVID, and we all know that Serco lost nearly £70 million over its 7 years of operating the service. So my question really is this: if this publicly owned model is any more or less profitable than it was under private controlled hands, is the Caledonian Sleeper any more or less profitable than it was under privately controlled hands? Would I get my time back, Presiding Officer? Because I'm keen to hear an answer. Okay. Well, perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can write to me. I think there's actually a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of goodwill in the Chamber to make ScotRail succeed. We all want to see it succeed. But I would like to see that decarbonisation strategy develop. I would like to see those issues, particularly local anecdotal issues around reliability and punctuality, improve. Because we all know there are points in the system where people are still not happy. For those reasons, I will support the Government's motion today, but I also will be supporting the Conservative and Labour Party amendments too, because I do think that Scotland's railway is something we should all be proud of, but it also needs to be fit for the future. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Douglas Lumsden. Up to 6 minutes, Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the chance to speak in support of this motion today, which marks a really significant milestone in Scotland's transport history. 20 years ago, the devolution of executive powers over rail funding, specification and strategy gave Scotland the tools to shape, or some of the tools to shape, its own railway. Now, today we celebrate not only that landmark decision, but also the tangible progress that has been made. And over these 2 decades, Scotland's railway has undergone a transformation, some of which we have heard today. And we've seen the electrification of over 570 kilometres of track, the opening of 30 new stations and a 20% increase in ScotRail passenger numbers. Now, these achievements are not just technical or operational, they represent a commitment to connectivity, sustainability and also public service. Now, Presiding Officer, in my Greenock and Inverclyde constituency, the benefits of rail investment are clear and also deeply felt. And that's not to say that there aren't any challenges, because there clearly are, but there have been benefits over that 20-year period. Now, Inverclyde has the highest number of train stations per head of population of any local authority area in Scotland. 13 stations, 14 if I count the IBM halt, which is currently mothballed, serving the communities across the Gourock and Wemyss lines. Now, these lines are vital arteries linking the constituency, in addition to outside of Inverclyde. This supports everything from daily commuting to tourism and also leisure. Now, stations like Wemyss, regularly recognised as one of the finest in the UK, are not just functional, they are iconic. Gourock Station, redeveloped during the last 15 years, now offers a modern, welcoming gateway to the town. Now, this development was a long-running saga beforehand, which this SNP government managed to unblock that particular logjam to get that development to happen. The new pedestrian crossing and lift at Port Glasgow Station, making it fully accessible for disabled passengers, is a testament to inclusive infrastructure. Now, I do want to pay a moment to pay tribute to my late council colleague, Councillor Jim MacLeod, whose tireless campaigning drove the campaign and helped secure this investment. Now, his legacy is one of determination and service to the community. And there's also the replacement of the Class 314 trains with the introduction of the Class 385 trains within over the last 20 years. Now, Presiding Officer, the delivery of the scrapping of peak rail fares is not only impactful, it's also practical. It puts money back into the pockets of my constituents and makes rail travel more accessible and also equitable. Now, let me share just some examples from Inverclyde. A journey from Wemyss to Glasgow Central has dropped from £16.50 to £10.40, a saving of £6.10 or 37%. From Gourock, the fare drops from £15.60 down to £9.90, a saving of £5.70 or 36.5%. Greenock Central to Glasgow now costs £9.10. £9.10 instead of the £14, a 35% reduction. And Port Glasgow, our busy station, up to Glasgow goes from £12.60 down to £8.50, a saving of £4.10 or 32.5%. For a daily commuter from Gourock, this could mean an annual saving of nearly £1,200. Now, that's a substantial benefit, especially during a cost of living crisis. But this is part of the cost of living guarantee from the SNP in government. But having so many stations also does bring some challenges. Now, the open nature of the network has led to issues with antisocial behaviour, particularly during the warmer months, when youths travel to Inverkip and Means Bay to access the waterfront. Now, I welcome the introduction of ScotRail's travel safe teams on the Inverclyde lines. Their presence has helped reduce incidents, but it hasn't eliminated them. But they do need some more assistance. I also want to commend British Transport Police for their continued efforts in the same issues. But their work is essential and they deserve our full support, but they also do need more assistance. Presiding Officer, while ScotRail has made great strides, many of the issues that it faces are long-standing, and that's why I believe it's time for Network Rail to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Having one organisation responsible for both infrastructure and operations would allow for better coordination, faster decision-making and also more accountability. It would remove unnecessary barriers and enable a truly integrated approach to rail delivery in Scotland. We've already seen the benefits of devolution. Scotland's Railway has consistently delivered strong operational performance and high passenger satisfaction, among the best in these islands. The £12 billion that the Cabinet Secretary referenced earlier, that investment over the past 20 years has sustained and grown the network through value-for-money projects, including the complete renewal of the Caledonian sleeper fleet and also the electrification of key routes. I also welcome the progression of the new train fleet procurement, which will modernise the rolling stock and improve the passenger experience. But, Presiding Officer, the UK Government's current proposals for rail reform draw heavily on the success of Scotland's devolved model. Now, that is recognition of what this government has achieved. But I'm sorry, I don't have time. I don't have time. But let me be clear that any reforms that would diminish the powers of Scottish ministers or the role of this Parliament would be unacceptable. Scotland's railway must benefit at least as much from these reforms as is promised for England and Wales. Now, in closing, I do want to praise the Scottish Government for its bold and visionary decisions, taking the ScotRail franchise into public hands, investing in new rolling stock and removing peak fares. Now, these actions reflect a commitment to a railway that serves the people, not profit, a railway that is inclusive, sustainable and also accountable. And certainly, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I do want that journey to continue and also want to ensure that Scotland Railway remains a source of pride, progress and also possibility for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Douglas Lumsden to be followed by Emma Roddick. Up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I must admit I do enjoy taking part in a rail debate. I feel a bit of a rail geek. I love the whole nostalgia of the railway, the history and the engines. And the earliest memory I have from being on a train was as a young lad, maybe about 7 or 8 years old. And we had special tickets to go on the brand new Intercity 125. It was going from Aberdeen to Aviemore. It was a special day trip to mark these new trains coming into service, and we only got tickets because one of our neighbours was a train driver. I felt really lucky. But little did I know that nearly 50 years later, these trains would still be in service in places like Mexico, Nigeria and Scotland. The SNP espouse the value of net zero, yet shamefully allow a situation where we rely on these gas-guzzling hand-me-downs to connect our cities. I was actually on one of these trains, these 50-year-old trains, recently with Russell Finlay. The sockets didn't work. We mentioned it to the person on board and they said, well, most of them don't. The catering section on these trains I don't think has ever been open and just take up space. The trolley service was still offering the same old tired selection and the Wi-Fi was unusable. If the SNP government think they are operating a world-class rail service, then they are completely deluded. We are miles behind other developed countries. I'll give way to Mark Ruskell.
Mark Ruskell.
Thank him for giving way. I was wondering if he could just reflect on the fact that this has been a failure of the privatisation of the rolling stock companies. They have kept trains running far longer than they should have been, trains that should have been scrapped far earlier and should have been replaced with modern fleet.
Douglas Lumsden.
Ruskell needs to remember when these intercity trains were taken back up to Scotland to run for ScotRail. That was only about 6 years ago. So we're miles behind other developed countries when it comes to intercity services. But I guess I should be thankful that it was actually running. During recess, I attended the convention in Inverness organised by community groups angry with the impact of major energy infrastructure. I got on the 6 p.m. train to get me back to Aberdeen, only for it to be cancelled because the air conditioning wasn't working. Simply opening the windows was not a good enough solution. We were all told to wait 3.5 hours for the next train. No bus replacement service, no option to get on the warm train, just told to wait. A rolling stock out with the Central Belt is an embarrassment, something the government's motion fails to acknowledge. Because the motion today before us attempts to paint a rosy picture of rail services in Scotland, while in reality, for many parts of our country, the service falls way short of what is expected in a modern country, and in some parts is simply not existent. But it could be far better, and even the SNP know this. Back in 2016, a few months before the Scottish Parliament elections, the SNP committed to spending £200 million to reduce journey times between Aberdeen and the Central Belt by 20 minutes by 2026. Travellers hoped one day to travel a 120-mile route in about 2 hours. Maybe the only section of single track between Aberdeen and continental Europe at Ulsan would finally be dualled. Maybe sections of the line straightened to make it faster. 9 years later, and approximately only 5% of the committed money spent, the people of the North East can finally see what this announcement was, a pre-election gimmick by this rotten, devolved government. But in the North East, we're getting used to the broken promises by the SNP. The £200 million rail improvement programme has gone the same way as dualling of the A96 and the Alex Salmond commitment of dualling the A90 north of Ellon. And dualling of the A90 north of Ellon is important to many of my constituents because rail services simply do not exist for many. In Aberdeen Donside, there is only one station. In Aberdeenshire East, there is only one station. In Bamshire and Bucking Coast, there are no stations. So I encourage the SNP members who like to celebrate the removal of peak fares to share a thought for many in the North East who will not benefit one bit from this policy. Central Belt bias once again. Rail services in the North East could be improved. My colleague Liam Kerr has a petition to open stations at Cove and Newton Hill to the south of Aberdeen. But these calls seem to be falling on deaf ears with no support forthcoming from the SNP government. And of course, we have the excellent campaign for North East Rail proposing new routes to Fraserburgh and Peterhead, which would unlock huge economic benefits to the North East. But once again, this has been met with a lukewarm reception from the SNP government. And when it comes to rail, there are even more broken promises by the SNP. We were, of course, told that rail services would be decarbonised by 2035, and that's since been pushed back a decade. And there seems to be very little detail even for this new deadline. Diesel trains we have will have to be replaced soon, and there will be no option but to replace them with other diesel trains, probably more hand-me-down trains from parts of the country that have got their act together and electrified. Presiding Officer, I also want to mention quickly Caledonian Sleeper. 2 years after bringing it into public ownership, the question must be asked, what was the point? No new services, fares are not reduced, we still have separate management teams with ScotRail with its own, and Chief Executive of Caledonian Sleeper costing in the region of £250,000. More integration would have made sense. A change that was made at the taxpayer's expense just to satisfy the egos and ideologies of the SNP. So overall, presiding officers, ScotRail are running fewer trains than before COVID. Decarbonisation has been pushed back a decade. ScotRail are running half-a-century-old trains. Caledonian Sleeper prices have increased alongside the burden to the taxpayer. The facilities on board ScotRail trains are miles behind where they should be. The promised £200 million for North East Rail improvements was a lie. And the SNP think this is a cause for celebration.
Mr. Lumsden,
instead of tinkering for tinkering's sake, the SNP should be focused on the day job, provide a clean, fast, modern, reliable rail service and actually deliver on the promises they made.
Thank you, Mr Lumsden. I would remind backbenchers that speeches of up to 6 minutes. With that, I call Emma Roddick to be followed by Richard Leonard. Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. From today's motion, two things are very clear to me. The SNP is good for Scotland's railway, and improvements are easier to make for Scotland's railway when the powers lie here in Scotland. I'm a very regular user of Scotland's railways. I'm fresh off a train this morning from my home in Inverness, and I'll be back up again on Thursday night. I often use the Far North, West Highland and Kyle lines, as well as the Aberdeen link for getting the ferry to Shetland or Orkney, and many of Scotland's other routes to get along to Callie-Thistle away games. I love being able to work on the train, sometimes sleep on the train if it's very late, and generally get to skip nighttime driving. So I was incredibly excited when, as a candidate, I heard that the SNP was going to commit to nationalising ScotRail this session. It felt like such a strong commitment to make for a fairer country, because a fairer country must include transport links which are accessible, affordable and appropriate for different areas in the country. The profit motive of a private company often comes at the expense of long-term investment, a barrier which is no longer in place for this government. I had mentioned in an online meeting only the night before the announcement that I thought this would be a great step forward, leading to some people in my local branch to credit me with the announcement. I was not, but I have been in regular contact with the Cabinet Secretary and her predecessors to push on some other issues. There are many things that I would love to see improved about our services and infrastructure in the Highlands. Doubling of the Highland Main Line has already been mentioned, which would reduce the impact of disruption, as well as offer the potential for shorter journey times and more freight capacity. A loop, Lentrin, Delmore, not particularly fussed, to build resilience on the Far North Line, and other improvements that could move freight off our roads and passengers out of cars. A thriving rail network in the north of Scotland is crucial to decarbonising the transport system overall. We have got to support critical industries in my region, be it the wooden pallets from West Fraser or whisky that is travelling from everywhere and to everywhere, to become more sustainable, and that requires rail freight being a viable alternative to HGVs on the A9 or the A96. Certainly.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the member for giving way. She makes a really important point about doing all infrastructure upgrades simultaneously to get that best utilisation of the line. Do you think there might be a risk in simply chasing decarbonisation as one metric at the expense of increasing capacity on the line? So we need to do both at once, because just doing the electrification might preclude further investments in the future.
Emma Roddick.
Yes, certainly, and hope that nothing I said gave any other indication, because to me it's one and the same. Increasing capacity is going to decarbonise, and if we decarbonise in the right order, then it is going to benefit passengers and those who use our railway for freight at exactly the same time. Now, my loyalty to taking the train to work here is possible because of the time it takes, being comparable to driving, and that is not the case everywhere yet. It can take twice as long to get to Wick by rail than by car, and the West Highland line, though scenic, is not often an option for me when attending meetings in the southwest of my region. I'm very clear that these improvements are only possible with the Scottish Government in charge, and I'm certain that they'd be more forthcoming if the Scottish Government had control over every aspect of budget setting, revenue raising and our railways. The progress made this session is incredible, nationalising ScotRail and the Caledonian Sleeper, scrapping peak rail fares and opening or reopening a number of stations, including Inverness Airport, which I had the pleasure of attending the opening of and making use of since. Many other changes to ticketing have offered my constituents good deals on regular journeys, and of course the record extends beyond the last 4 years. The SNP government was personally responsible for prolonging my weekly commute from Alness to Inverness as a teenager by reconnecting Conan Bridge to the railway. And while it seems like most of the Cabinet Secretary's portfolio, or at least the tricky bits, relate to the Highlands and Islands, I do have a great appreciation for what has happened elsewhere too. I took the train to Galashiels earlier this year, and wherever it is in the country, I think it deserved a point of pride that the longest domestic line in the UK in a century was delivered by the Scottish Government. If the Cabinet Secretary is ever looking for suggestions on what new line could beat that record, I do have a wee wish list of long lines that could keep Scotland on the right track. Because we know the impact. The Cabinet Secretary's motion mentions a 5th increase in passenger numbers. What that cannot tell you, but what we know lies behind it, are people who would otherwise have used their cars, as well as people who would have been stuck at home because they cannot use a car. It has people who would otherwise have driven to the retail park instead of shopping in town centres, as well as people who would otherwise only shop online. This increase in passenger numbers has a benefit for those passengers, for the climate and for local economies. But all of this, and whatever we do in future, pales in comparison to what would be possible with independence. What has been done under devolution is impressive, but it's incomplete. And while it's fantastic to see that the UK Government might be getting ready to follow Scotland in various policies like nationalising rail, we must be clear that we need to be looking at more powers and certainly not the diminishing of the current situation, which has delivered so much. Scotland shouldn't need permission to keep improving the railway, and with independence would come full fiscal powers and the agility to react to public pressure on what users of our railway need. In short, it would give us the strength here in Scotland to do even more.
The member is about to conclude.
Thank you.
The member has concluded. Thank you, Ms Roddick. I now call Richard Leonard to be followed by Kevin Stewart. Mr Leonard.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And can I declare my interest as the convener of the RMT Scottish Parliamentary Group? And let me begin with some common ground with the Government. Some consensus. In this session of Parliament, we have seen the removal of Abellio and Serco, and so the removal of foreign and private ownership from Scotland's train operations. And we have seen them replaced by the reintroduction of public ownership of both ScotRail and the Caledonian Sleeper. This is a victory, not least, for the RMT and the other rail unions, who have never stopped in their campaign inside and outside Parliament for the return of our railways to public ownership. I applaud too the promotion of the Transport Minister to the rank of Cabinet Secretary and the appointment of the General Secretary of the Scottish TUC to the board of publicly owned Scottish Rail Holdings Limited. Although I have to remind people on a regular basis what Tony Benn, whose centenary we celebrate this year, used to say, nationalisation plus Lord Robens does not add up to socialism. And of course, there is also widespread agreement on the Scottish Government's recent conversion to the scrapping of peak rail fares once and for all, which represents, in my view, another victory for the campaign led first and foremost by the railway trade unions. But I'm bound to say that I never understood why for a whole year the Scottish Government maintained that it was only existing, undeserving and, worse yet, middle-class passengers on above-average earnings who gained from the scrapping of peak fares. I never understood it. A policy of peak fares is a tax on all workers travelling to and from their work, who are, by my definition, the working class. So this reawakening by the Government is welcome, but they must go further. Cuts to British Transport Police's operations in Scotland remain a very real and present threat and are at the forefront of the minds of frontline workers dealing with antisocial behaviour, including assaults in our stations and on our trains. Yes, I will.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I share his concerns? Can I say those cuts have not come financially from the Scottish side of this arrangement, and he should be making those representations to his UK Labour Government colleagues?
Richard Leonard.
Well, let me turn then to cuts to the Rail Systems Alliance Scotland budget in Control Period 7, which have led directly to redundancies and job cuts at Babcock Rail in Scotland over the last year, and which is compromising safety-critical work. So these cuts must be reversed. And last Friday, the Cabinet Secretary announced the purchase of 69 new trains for the ScotRail network, a welcome and long overdue announcement. But I hope that the Government will reject the old ways of procurement, where we end up with our trains owned by private capital and leased through rolling stock companies, an oligopoly of private profiteering corporations like Angel Trains, Porterbrook and Eversholt Rail, which are owned and controlled from Australia, Canada, Germany, France, Hong Kong, and that's where all the profits go as well. I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will instead issue green bonds, an idea backed in a report launched in this Parliament this year by ASLEF, as a progressive alternative to extractive capitalism as a public financing model in place of a private financing model. In recent weeks, I've also raised with the Cabinet Secretary the outsourcing of ScotRail customer experience services to Teleperformance, a company that promotes the offshoring of its contracts to its South African subsidiary. a company which is also anti-trade union. Now, the Cabinet Secretary tells me that this is an operational decision for ScotRail Trains Limited. But I say to her this afternoon in Parliament, does she care so little for those workers in Scotland who currently provide that service? What about their upskilling? Where is the government Fair Work First commitment to those workers? Has it just melted? Is it optional? The Cabinet Secretary should step in, halt this threatened injustice and bring this service and these jobs back in-house to benefit both workers and passengers. And finally, there is something else which the Cabinet Secretary also regards as an operational matter for ScotRail, which we have debated before, but which I must raise again. The big cuts in ticket office opening hours taking place in almost 100 stations out of 143 staffed across Scotland. A former First Minister used to try and tell me, frankly, this was modernisation. The Cabinet Secretary now tells me that these cuts are done in the name of, I quote, frontline customer service improvements. But I say that is a fraud on the travelling public, because the Cabinet Secretary knows, and the many representative groups who have opposed this change know, that the removal of staff from railway station ticket offices will not simply deter passengers, it will deny many passengers access to public transport altogether. So I welcome public ownership, but it must be an equal and inclusive public ownership. It must be a transparent and accountable public ownership, and it must be a comprehensive public ownership. Let's have public ownership built on the timeless principles and the enduring ethical practice of popular, democratic, I would argue, socialist ownership and control.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. I now call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Sanjay Gohani. Mr Stewart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And under an SNP government, we have seen ScotRail and Caledonian Sleeper being brought back into public ownership, and peak time rail fares have been abolished. And since 2007, this Scottish Government has invested over £11 billion in Scotland's rail infrastructure. So the last 20 years have indeed been good for Scotland's railways, and the work of this SNP government in supporting our railways and our railway-going passengers has been immense. However, I hope that I can be forgiven if I can focus on Aberdeen and the North East rather than the whole of Scotland. The past 20 years has seen improvements in North East Rail in three key areas: the upgrading of track, the renovation of old stations and the opening of new stations. For travellers heading northwest from Aberdeen to Inverness, the Aberdeen to Inverness Improvement Project has resulted in significant gains for passengers. On the track front, signalling has been enhanced between Inch and Aberdeen, and the line between Inverurie and Kitty Brewster Junction has once again been redoubled. And with regard to upgrading old stations, the station at Forres has been rebuilt and the platforms at both Elgin and Inch stations have been lengthened. Lawrence Kirk station was reopened. And last but not least, the reopening of Kintore station after 60 years was a critical milestone and has been a great success. And this station now sees 28 ScotRail trains stopping daily. Improvements for points south of Aberdeen are currently underway thanks to the Aberdeen to Central Belt Enhancement Project. And the project will see 20 minutes knocked off journey times for Aberdonians heading to Glasgow or Edinburgh. And this ambitious project will ensure those improvements. Network Rail has carried out ground investigation work across the entire track. And the defunct bridges at Irons Hill and Lunan Mill have been demolished. There is, of course, much work still to be done, including vital improvements at both Aberdeen Railway Station, as well as the construction of freight loops to manage mixed traffic. And when this current work is completed, the North East will enjoy those shorter journey times to the Central Belt. Having discussed the past improvements on the line from Aberdeen to Inverness and present improvements on the lines from Aberdeen to Glasgow and Edinburgh, It's vital that we don't lose sight of future improvements for the railways in the North East. That future has to be the reopening of the lines from Aberdeen to Peterhead and Fraserburgh. Thanks to the Better Together alliance of the Tories commissioning the beaching cuts and the Labour Party wielding the actual axe, Peterhead is the largest settlement in mainland UK without a railway station, and Fraserburgh is the second. This was a terrible injustice and is an unacceptable status quo. The Campaign for North East Rail is a grassroots movement driven by engineers and local advocates who have put forward a clear, well-researched blueprint for a revitalised railway network. The campaign is about more than trains. It is about regenerating our coastal towns, supporting our vital fishing industry by enabling the shift of freight from road to rail, and unlocking the potential, the economic potential of our region. Most importantly, it is about the moral and economic imperative to ensure that no community is left behind. Now, last year, the Campaign for North East Rail and Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce produced the Buchan Sustainable Transport Study, which provides a compelling evidence base for reopening the Aberdeen to Peterhead line. And there are a number of reasons why this is an imperative. The lack of a railway means that lorry loads of beer and truckloads of fish share single-track roads often, with folk commuting into work and with folk taking their kids on the school run. Improving freight transport would make a vital contribution to the economic regeneration of the area. As usual, however, it is those who rely on public transport who are hit the heaviest in these areas, with 85% of the people who would like to take the bus often decide not to because of the long journey and unreliable buses. That's a major blight on folk of the North East, and improved public transport connectivity would be a major force in improving the economic opportunities for everyday folk in our corner of Scotland. So I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to look at what has happened in Borders, as we've heard, and leaving those major advantages that are now in play there, and think about the same for the North East. Listen to the Campaign for North East Rail, listen to Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, and let's do right and put to bed the wrongs of beaching, which closed those lines from Aberdeen to Peterhead and Fraserburgh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I now call Standish Gohani to be followed by Christine Graham. Dr Gohani.
Thank you. The motion before us today is classic SNP. It's a self-congratulatory tale of trumpets, selective successes, while ignoring glaring failures. Yep. If Thomas the Tank Engine ran Scotland's railways, we'd have really useful engines. Under the SNP, it could be argued we've had really useless policies. Yes, there have been new stations, some electrification and anniversaries to celebrate, but behind the rhetoric lies a government that has left Scotland's transport infrastructure, and with it our economy, fall behind. The SNP is a master of patting itself on the back, but when it comes to real delivery, particularly in Glasgow, it is utterly failing. Like Gordon, the big engine, the SNP loves to boast it's the fastest, but when you look at the timetable, they're always running late. Nowhere is that more obvious than in this government's gold standard incompetence, its failure to deliver a rail link between Glasgow Airport and Glasgow city centre. This is not a minor omission. Glasgow Airport is arguably Scotland's principal business airport, and in my opinion, the most important. It's the gateway for conferences at the SEC, for tourism across the west of Scotland, and for international investment. And yet, unlike airports in Manchester, London, even Vilnius in Lithuania, there is no direct rail connection. Instead, travellers step off their flights into traffic jams, bus queues, and this is not the image of a modern, forward-thinking Scotland. Rather, it's symbolic of the shambles that the SNP have put us into with economic incompetence? Yes, I will.
I thank the member for taking that intervention. Whilst I do agree that a link between Glasgow and the airport would be fantastic, does he realise that due to the limitations of the actual track coming out of Glasgow, that could impact on services to Ayrshire, which I'm sure that he wouldn't want to see happen? And could he ask for that investment in terms of the actual track itself?
Stanish Gohani.
Well, you've just come on to the next part of my speech. Let's cast our mind back to this project, the Glasgow Airport Rail Link, that was planned, costed and backed by business in 2006. Strathclyde Partnership for Transport produced an environmental statement and an economic impact assessment. These showed the clear benefits of delivering such a rail link: faster journeys, reduced congestion, reduced emissions, and billions, yes, billions, in long-term economic gain. But what happened? In 2009, the SNP pulled the brakes, cancelled, gone. And since then, a decade and a half of dithering excuses, glossy brochures, and so-called reviews. The government now tells us Clyde Metro is the answer. But Clyde Metro is not a train. It's a bedtime story. We are expected to sit like railway children, waving our flags and waiting for salvation to appear at the end of the tunnel. But there is no train coming, just more SNP announcements delayed again and again. And the SNP admit it themselves. The case for investment is not due to be completed until 2027. That means more years of waiting, years more of lost opportunity, years more watching Edinburgh, yes, Edinburgh, overtake Glasgow as the airport of choice, even for a number of Glaswegians. Presiding Officer, as a Glasgow Region MSP, I hear from business leaders, from the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, from constituents. They are crying out for this connection. They know about missed opportunities, like convention organisers choosing other cities because they cannot ask delegates to waste precious time stuck on the M8. In fact, work on the M8 this week set to cause 9 months of further disruptions, including overnight closures on both the eastbound and westbound carriages at Junction 26. Investors also look elsewhere, and tourists who might have chosen Glasgow take the easier option and fly into Edinburgh. Presiding Officer, the SNP are good at blowing the whistle and shouting peep peep, but ministers do not have their eyes on the track, certainly when it comes to connecting Glasgow with its airport. This could all have been avoided if the SNP had acted when they had the chance. In contrast, Manchester has a rail link to its airport since 1993. Luton has the Dart driverless shuttle, taking passengers in minutes to the stations to terminal, connecting seamlessly with frequent trains to London. Even Lithuania has a rail service. If they can do it, why can't Scotland's largest city? The answer is simple: because under the SNP, infrastructure is sacrificed to political priorities, competence is in short supply, and ministers never feel the consequences. After all, they have their governmental limos. Yeah. If Thomas the Tank Engine ran Scotland Railways, Glasgow would already have a line to the airport. But SNP ministers in control, all we have are weighty excuses. And it's not just Glasgow Airport. Look at the wider picture. Services cut since the pandemic, electrification plans delayed, sleeper service more expensive but no better, 50-year trains still in use, and tragically the Stonehaven rail crash reminds us all that safety must come before spin. And don't forget, since 2006 the Scottish Government has been responsible for ensuring our railways are safe and resilient. 5 years on from the Stonehaven rail tragedy, key improvements demanded by investigators have yet to be completed. Scotland deserves better, Glasgow deserves better, and our economy deserves better, because the truth is this: connectivity is not just about transport, it's about growth. It's about making Glasgow a competitive global city. It's about supporting our NHS staff, our businesses and communities who rely on reliable, efficient links.
Thank you, Dr Mahoney. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by Casey Clark. Ms Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, despite the unexpected miserable contributions of Sandish Gulhani and Douglas Lumsden, I have something at least in common with Douglas Lumsden. I too am a railway geek. I prefer to let the train take the strain. But today I shall concentrate on the success of Borders Railway, because today marks exactly 10 years since its formal reopening. Viewing a map of the rail network in Scotland pre-beaching is eye-opening. The first beaching report identified over 2,000 stations and 5,000 miles of railway line for closure, 55% of stations, 30% of route miles. The Waverley Line on January 5, 1969 was one victim of those cuts. Those cuts did not stem losses and, unlike now, took no account of the wider social and economic impact of railways. Today we do, and additionally and crucially the reduction in emissions so damaging to this planet. Electrification was part of the future-proofing of the Borders Railway and is on the cards now, as well as new rolling stock. The project to return the Borders Railway took root with a 17,000 signature petition to this Parliament in the name of Petra Bieberbach. I met her by chance on Gala High Street just after my election in 1999, and as a member of the Parliament's Petitions Committee then, advised she present it to our committee. It was. In 1999, the Campaign for Borders Rail was also established, and I set up the cross-party group for Borders Rail here. However, it was not an easy parliamentary route. Sarah Boyk will understand, she was through this with me. A feasibility study, the Scott Wilson report, stated that patronage projections for a new line were not encouraging, stating none of the route options examined producing a positive cost-benefit value. How wrong was that? The economic case was built on projected housing development, 700 in the Borders and 1,100 in Midlothian. Unbelievably, that led to an anti-rail backlash from the breakaway local Borders Party, describing it as a colossal waste of money. The Tories also called then for the money not to be used, but to be used instead for dualling the A7, but thankfully they later recanted. That petition in time received the unanimous support of the Parliament's Rural Affairs Committee, and on 14 June 2006 the bill to restore the line was almost unanimously passed. In 2007, the SNP government committed to build the line, and build it did. I reprise this because predictions were way off course. For Sue Webber, that past achievement builds the case for future rail developments and indeed how to build a railway. Practical lessons were learned. Nobody had built one here in years. Those huge housing developments happened. Fields next to the station at Shawfair will soon be bursting with new homes. Easy access there to the railway is already true for Gorebridge, Newton Grange and Tweedbank. One look at the full car parks show you how busy the line is, far flung from the gloomy predictions, taking the train and not the A7. Now, here are some stats. Borders Railway has seen a significant increase in passengers, rising from initial forecasts of 600,000 to approaching 2 million in 2018 to 19. By September this year, over 13 million passenger journeys have taken place since its opening. In its wake, former railway buildings along the line have been transformed through community efforts. Newton Grange, Stow Station House, and now with proposals to Gorebridge Station House. Groups also work to raise funds for Campaign for Borders Rail, such as the Sentry Box at Galashiels. And we have the beautiful station flower displays this year, particularly stunning at Gorebridge, wholly maintained by a few volunteers. The communities take their railway very personally, having won it themselves. Of course, it's about passengers. And removing peak fares will save someone travelling Tweedbank to Edinburgh at least £7 a day, more bums on seats. Kids for a quid is another excellent initiative. But the railway is also about so much more, about the wider economy and the social fabric of the communities. That Borders Railway has more than pioneered not just how to build a railway, but what the economic and social benefits of a railway are. And its extension through Hawick to Carlisle will complete that social and economic journey and is living proof for other future railway developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Graham. I now call Katie Clark to be followed by Graham Simpson. Ms Clark.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I refer to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. It's a pleasure to follow Christine Graham's contribution, and I was very pleased that she raised the beaching cuts, which I believe have proved to be a disaster for many communities. I hope that we all now accept that supporting and extending rail services are vital to meeting our climate change targets and more sustainable transport. The scrapping of peak fares, which came into effect last week, is very welcome. Ending peak fares is important to increase passenger numbers by making rail travel more affordable for working people. That's why the Scottish Government's decision to end the pilot scheme last year was strongly opposed both by passengers and rail unions. It is a testament to their tireless campaigning that the Scottish Government has now changed its position and have scrapped peak fares. And I congratulate the Cabinet Secretary on this decision. But whilst the scrapping of peak fares will make rail travel more affordable for many, as has been said, in many parts of Scotland, people won't benefit. And it's important that rail travel is truly accessible for all passengers. And that's also why the rail unions and campaigners have repeatedly warned about the impact of cuts to ticket office opening hours. Reducing ticket office opening hours means that some stations will no longer have guaranteed staffing for notable periods of time. This leaves many passengers, particularly women, the disabled and the elderly, unable to seek assistance. It also leads to passengers feeling unsafe at a time when crime on Scotland's rail network is also increasing. Yes, of course.
Jamie Green.
I actually agree with what the member is saying around the closure of ticket offices, but we should also remind the wider travelling public around the enhanced CCTV and help point monitoring that happens in every station. I've been to the centre in Paisley that monitors this. I hope the member can go and do the same. But we should promote and encourage that does make our stations as safe as they can be without ticketed office.
Katie Clark.
The Scottish Government's own research has shown that passengers feel safer at staff stations. So I take on board what Jamie Green is saying, but we know that women in particular and other groups tell us repeatedly that they feel safer if there's staff available. Yet many stations across West Scotland are being affected by cuts to ticket office opening hours. Ticket offices at Ardrossan South Beach, Irvine, Largs and Saltcoats, along with many others, are seeing opening hours reduced by at least 1 hour or more. There are also ongoing issues with the punctuality and reliability of ScotRail services, which the Scottish Government must address. ScotRail, as has been said, is still running fewer services than pre-pandemic. There were over 63,000 services ran by ScotRail this July, which is 6,000 fewer than in July 2019. More than 17,000 services were cancelled last year, with over 55% of services failing to arrive at their scheduled time. Last year, for example, I raised concerns about the punctuality and reliability on the Largs to Glasgow line. Over 200 trains were cancelled on this line alone last year, with over 500 services late. And in 2023, a total of 455 services on this line were either fully or partially cancelled. This simply isn't good enough. This repeated failure to deliver rail services for the people of Largs, Ardrossan and the wider area is unacceptable. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated example. I hope that action is now being taken to improve infrastructure, reduce cancellations and ensure trains are running on time. As I said earlier, crime on Scotland's rail network is increasing. There has been a 1/3 increase in reported crime since before the pandemic. The number of reported sex crimes increased by 2/3 during the same period. More than 200 women and girls were assaulted, harassed or faced unwanted sexual behaviour on Scotland's rail services in the last year alone. Rail workers also are facing an unacceptable level of abuse and violence, with rail workers raising concerns about the abuse they receive. Women transport workers in particular, who I have spoken to, have told me about the increase in threatening behaviour that they are subjected to. ScotRail staff were subjected to over 100 attacks on trains and at stations last year, more than double the number reported in 2022. I hope that the Cabinet Secretary today will outline what steps the Scottish Government are taking to improve the safety of rail services for women and girls. The UK Government's proposals to create a single, publicly owned and nationally integrated rail network are welcome. I welcome that they are happening. And I hope that Scottish and UK ministers will be able to work together to ensure Great British Railways and ScotRail both deliver improvements to infrastructure, reliability and safety, and that we continue to have debates of this nature in this chamber.
Thank you, Ms Clark. And I now call Graeme Simpson. Mr Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary has disappointed me. She has. She persists in using kilometres, as she has done in this motion. When we use miles in this country, 570 kilometres is 354 miles. Presiding Officer, I think we all want to see ScotRail succeed. We do. Many of us use the train regularly. It's the backbone of Scotland's public transport system. But we've got to accept that there are challenges there. In the past year alone, over 17,000 train services were cancelled, and far too many are still not arriving on time. Presiding Officer, well, I've got very, very little time. Very, very little time, but I'll let you in.
Cabinet Secretary. Does he realise there are hundreds of thousands of journeys, that the cancellations are a few percentage? Many of them are because of infrastructure and network rail responsibilities, and indeed because of the number of storms that we've had, not least Storm Floris, in the recent weeks.
Graeme Simpson.
Well, I'm going to cheer up the Cabinet Secretary because I do have some positive things to say. I do. Overall customer satisfaction with ScotRail is 91%. That's among the best in Britain. We've got to accept that. Punctuality, 92.9%. That sounds pretty good, but still not good enough. We've got to accept that. But we do need more investment in infrastructure. We do need more modern signalling, track upgrades and station improvements. And it's still the case that ScotRail has one of the oldest fleets in Britain. Now, we need more electrification. We need to see a plan for battery electric trains to reduce emissions, improve service quality. For hydrogen, Jamie Green mentioned that. And affordability is key. Speakers have mentioned the removal of peak fares. Now, I remember leading a debate in this Parliament where Parliament voted to end peak fares, and the Scottish Government have had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do this, but I'm glad they have. We need integrated ticketing. The Cabinet Secretary knows that I've been going on about this for, it seems like, years. It needs to work across trains, buses, tram, ferries. I'm lucky enough to live in East Kilbride, which has had investment, and it's very welcome. We've got 2 new stations. They're fantastic. We're going to get electric trains.
Mr Simpson, please bring your remarks to a close.
I will. Presiding Officer, there's more work to do, but I think we have to celebrate what's been done well and actually thank the staff of ScotRail for doing that.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. We will now move to closing speeches. I call on Mark Ruskell to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think it's been a pretty passionate debate, actually, this afternoon. It's certainly given all the railway geeks in the chamber their 6 minutes of fame, although I would say to Sandesh Gulhani, I don't think he's going to be replacing Michael Choo-Choo Patillo anytime soon. But, you know, Kevin Stewart, I think, passionately talking about the campaign for North East Rail, Christine Graham talking about that passionate story about Borders Rail as well and the next steps for that. And we've heard about Winchborough, we've heard about Newborough, and lines in the Highlands as well. And I think the Cabinet Secretary is right to underline the successes that we've had in reopening new rail stations, 25 stations, 4 new lines. And I was there in Leavenmouth earlier this year at the reopening of the Leavenmouth Railway, and I have to say it was a hugely emotional day. And I think it spoke to what Claire Baker was talking about, the perseverance of that community to build the case for the reopening of the Leavenmouth line. It was an incredible day, and I'm really pleased now that services have gone up to two every hour. I think that's fantastic. But Sue Webber has a point. There you go. Those are words I never thought I'd issue. I'd mention in the chamber. But Sue Webber does have a point here about planning and about how we plan for new rail stations to be reopened, because under the Strategic Transport Projects Review, which is Scotland's plan for transport, our big strategic plan for transport, the case for individual rail station reopenings does not feature anywhere at all. Individual rail station reopenings are treated on an individual case-by-case basis. They're not seen as strategic, even though they're part of a strategic network. And a number of years ago, the Greens made the case successfully to the Scottish Government that we needed a seed fund, a local rail development fund, to help communities to do the business cases, to build up the case for reopenings. And I'm pleased that Newborough and St Andrews and communities around Scotland have benefited from that. But there is a frustration here. I mean, it does take years and years and years to get through the STAG process, to engage with Transport Scotland officials and regional transport partnerships to build that case and for communities to see themselves as part of that bigger network. So, I'm heartened by what the Cabinet Secretary said about Newborough. A decision will be fairly soon, but this has been years and years in the making, and the stamina of communities, I think, is an issue here. Turning to rolling stock, we've had a few contributions on that. I quite enjoyed Richard Leonard's reflection that the rolling stock companies are effectively an oligopoly of extractive capitalism. And I do think we need a bit more attention on the ASLEF report. I think the government has got the opportunity here, and in a number of other areas too, to consider issuing green bonds that reinvest the revenues back into our public transport system. And I note that the Caledonian Rail Leasing Company is actually owned by foreign companies, and it generated £1.3 billion worth of dividends between 2012 and 2018, which were largely removed from this country and invested elsewhere. So, other models are possible, other models are normal elsewhere. Transport for London invested directly in the trains that was needed for Crossrail. And of course we need full borrowing powers that Emma Roddick has set out, but we've also got the powers that we have too. Turning to the passenger experience, a number of members have talked about timetables. What timetables should we have? Should we go back to the pre-COVID world? But I think we have to recognise that the world has moved on, and I think it would be very difficult to restore in full the timetables that we have. There's a shift now to effectively the most busiest time. Just let me expand the point, please. We have a shift now to the greatest usage effectively being leisure travel. So, I think peak rail and the removal of peak rail fares really speaks to that post-COVID world that we live in. And yes, there's a need to restore some services, but simply going back to that pre-COVID world, I don't think is acceptable. If there's a brief intervention.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank Mr Ruskell for giving way, and I'm glad that he's highlighted the changes in travel. Does Mr Ruskell agree with me that if we went back to that pre-COVID timetable, we may actually lose weekend services that are actually doing very well and bringing lots of income into our national railway system?
Mark Ruskell.
That was my point, that the peak usage now is actually a leisure usage, and it's very much at the weekend. So yes, we should be restoring services, but we have to see where we're at. I think a number of members have talked about safety as well, and like Jamie Green, I went to the customer service centre that ScotRail run in Dunfermline for the other half of Scotland, and I was really impressed by how much attention they're able to give customers through those customer service points and really offer any kind of advice and support. And I do wonder about whether that message is really getting out there. But I do still agree with Katie Clark that we really have to monitor those changes in ticket office opening hours, and I do have concerns about vulnerable passengers there. And I think I'd finish really just about, first-class ticketing. I think it's just been a discussion between me and the CabSec this afternoon on this. And I pressed that CabSec came with a list of all the services where there isn't first class. But it does beg the question, Cabinet Secretary, if it doesn't run on Dunblane to Edinburgh, why do we have first-class ticketing on Glasgow to Edinburgh? There is really no first-class offering anymore on ScotRail services. There isn't a leisure first-class offering like LNER and some other UK train operating companies offer. So, what is the point of it anymore? The ScotRail does get a little bit of income, say, if a passenger is travelling from Edinburgh to London or Aberdeen to London, they get a certain amount of income. But I think overall, on those key commuter routes, we should be freeing up the seats, allowing people to sit anywhere, because the good news is peak rail fares have gone. I think we are going to see increased patronage on our railways, and getting rid of first class is a good step towards
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. I now call on Sarah Boyack to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's debate because there is huge interest across the Chamber for improving our rail services right across Scotland and in the Lothians. And communities like Winchborough have been promised a station for years, and I want to thank Lawrence Fitzpatrick, the leader of West Lothian Council, for his persistence in pushing for this, because without a station it's harder for people to get to work, it leads to more delays and congestion on our roads, and that isn't good enough. The points made by Claire Baker about overcrowding also urgently need to be addressed. Christine Graham's mentioned the Borders Railway, way more people using it than anticipated, but we need the trains to be big enough. And trains from East Lothian and Fife are now regularly at capacity, and passengers can actually be left standing. And on some key routes, there are not even enough bike spaces. So capacity is key. And I think we've talked about this across the Chamber, that abolition of peak rail fares is a huge opportunity for Scotland because it makes rail travel more affordable and could potentially encourage people out of their cars. But it was a long time coming. It was the result of cross-party pressure, work from trade unions. But if it's going to be a real shift, we need the capacity on our trains so that people can use them. And we also need to have railway stations that enable people to get access to our trains. When I was Minister for Transport in the first term, I was proud to approve the Airdrie to Bathgate, Larkholt-Mulgai and Stirling to Alloa lines. And it's good to see the fact that it's 20 years since Airdrie to Bathgate was opened. But in December, in December, we're also going to be able to celebrate Larkholt to Mulgai being opened up. So there's something about the benefits of that. I think Mark Ruskell's point about strategic planning is absolutely critical, because we need to make sure we take a national approach to support our regions, and that benefits passengers, our economy and our environment. So it was good to hear about North East. I would like to have heard a bit more about Inverness, because the North routes urgently need access for passenger and freight connectivity. And before summer, we were lobbied by the freight sector about the need for freight routes linking to ferry connections in the southwest of Scotland. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think we need to go further, making sure stations are properly connected with access to local buses, safe cycling routes, walking access. And a key issue is accessibility, step-free access, lifts and ramps. We need to make sure that our railways are accessible for everybody. And the debate title is a strong platform. Platforms don't sell tickets. Several colleagues have talked about ticket offices. And we need to make sure that, although many of us use the ScotRail app, we need to make sure that people, for example, Audit Scotland has highlighted that around 1 in 10 people don't have internet access, and around 1 in 6 people lack foundational digital skills. So if you're going to get a sustained level of modal shift, we need to make sure accessibility is built in. I look at Waverley Station, where they relocated their ticket office this summer, making it less accessible for a lot of passengers who need to access tickets in person, and they also need in-person assistance. So in her summing up, I'd like to hear from the Cabinet Secretary about the companion travel scheme, because I've been working with Sight Scotland and RNIB Scotland, because they are pushing for making sure that passengers get the support they need when they need it, so that everybody can travel on our trains. We also need to make sure that passengers and railway staff are safe. I thought the points that Katie Clark and Richard Leonard made were very powerful about women passengers, and it's shocking 70% of RMT ScotRail members had experienced violence at work in the past year. 80% of those staff were lone workers. So again, I hope the Cabinet Secretary will outline what action can be taken to make people safe on our trains. We need to make sure that we build a railway that people feel is safe, that it's accessible, that it's worth the fare that they pay, and it deliberately links in our economy and our climate ambitions. It needs to be fit for purpose, needs to be resilient from extreme weather. Passengers deserve better. I want to focus just briefly that UK rail reforms are going to be a massive benefit, and there are explicitly no plans to diminish the powers that Scottish ministers have. We need the joint working that's been talked about between the UK and the Scottish Government. Particularly in Scotland, we need more trains, because we've now got 250 less trains running every day than pre-pandemic levels. We need more trains, accessible trains, affordable trains that everybody can access across the country. If we do that, we build passenger confidence, we build our economy, and we support our environment. Let's work together to get that done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call on Finlay Carson to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate is timely and an important opportunity to reflect on the progress, satisfactory or otherwise, made across Scotland's railways. And when we reflect on the contributions made this afternoon, it's clear that there is cross-party consensus that we all want a railway that delivers value for money and puts passengers first. Jamie Green firstly reinforced the Scottish Conservatives' point that we need the private sector to ensure a reliable, efficient service in modern, comfortable surroundings without requiring passengers to take out a second mortgage for a ticket. Now, if we can do that, we're halfway to winning back public confidence, and that's key to encouraging modal shift. Sue Webber and others spoke of the recent removal of peak rail fares, a welcome step, and we in these benches are pleased to see the Scottish Government respond to calls from across the Chamber to scrap the two-tier system, a welcome U-turn on their premature decision to end the first trial. Across the Chamber, we accept the journey ahead won't be easy. Much of Scotland's rail infrastructure dates back to the 19th century, and that presents real challenges. And if we're serious about modernisation, then both the Scottish and UK governments must work together to unlock private investment and commit to long-term upgrades. We heard Douglas Lumsden likes a bit of nostalgia. Douglas loves nostalgia so much he's still emotionally stuck in 1983, back when Aberdeen beat Real Madrid, and perms were peak fashion. But that nostalgia doesn't cover the 50-year-old intercity train still serving in Nigeria and in Scotland. He highlighted the Central Belt bias towards new rolling stock. Well, if he thinks it's bad in the North East, he should pay a visit to Stranraer, where the first train of the morning is referred to as the Polar Express because of the lack of heating. Presiding Officer, I'm not going to spend any more time summing up other members' contribution because, without exception, well, apart from the Cabinet Secretary, the calls from across the Chamber are for more to be done and quicker. My colleague Sue Webber, a long-time campaigner for Winchborough Railway Station, called for new developments and they should be aligned with areas of population growth. But we must be cautious. Expansion must not come at the expense of rural and remote communities. Scotland's railways must serve all of Scotland, not just the Central Belt. So I want to take my time to shine a spotlight on the South West, particularly Stranraer and the strategically vital port at Cairnryan. Like the region's road network, this area has been neglected for far too long. Back in 2012, Keith Brown, the then Transport Minister, and First Minister Alex Salmond set up the Stranraer Task Force. And at the time, Keith Brown said, and I quote, "I again repeat the Scottish Government's absolute commitment to rail services in Stranraer, and indeed to doing all we can do to improve and develop the service. Our current Rail 2024 2014 consultation allows the public to have their say in the future of railways in Scotland, and I can assure passengers that we will continue to ensure the delivery of the best possible service. Since then, surprise, surprise, services are less frequent and more focused on connections at Ayr rather than direct trains to Glasgow. More trains are now terminating at Ayr, requiring a change for Glasgow, and there are fewer early morning and late evening options compared to pre-COVID. Hardly an improvement. Now, Shanrar is a town with a proud past and now finally with momentum. Thanks to the Borderland Inclusive Growth Deal and the Stranraer Place Plan, we are seeing real investment, including a waterfront redevelopment expected to attract tens of thousands of additional visitors annually. But one thing is missing: a modern, reliable rail service to support this revival. We need a long-term strategy to improve passenger services and unlock freight potential, especially to shift heavy goods off the dangerous A77, to shift heavy goods off 77 and A75. Cairnryan remains a key national asset, yet lorries have to depend on these unfit-for-purpose roads. Investment in rail freight isn't just a local issue, it's a strategic priority for Scotland and the UK. And despite repeated commitments, rail services to and from Stranraer remain poor post-COVID. Communities are isolated, economic recovery is stalled, and passengers face some of the highest fares per mile in Scotland. And the Stranraer service was suspended for over 10 months following an arson attack on Ayr Station Hotel. One has to ask themselves, would such a delay be tolerated elsewhere? Presiding Officer, the South West is not a cul-de-sac. It's a corridor of opportunity. So I'm calling for a feasibility study to extend freight capabilities to Cairnryan, a clear timetable to restore pre-COVID services levels and address unfair rail fares, and a renewed commitment to station improvements in Stranraer, including the creation of a new fit-for-purpose facility that reflects the town's ambition and serves the needs of 21st century travellers. For 9 years, I worked with stakeholders to make this vision a reality. What my constituents and rail passengers across Scotland want is simple: a ticket to ride, not the track of their tears.
Thank you, Mr Carson. And I now call on Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop to respond to the debate. Up to 9 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, today's subject matter is of enormous importance. It provides a timely opportunity for this Parliament to mark the achievements of many people contributing to the rail industry in Scotland over the last 20 years, but it also allows us to set out what is happening next in our railways and also to set out our aims for the UK Government's imminent Railways Bill, but also express our concerns. I think people have shown their passion and their interest in rail, and I'm delighted that the Government has been able to provide that opportunity to discuss different points. Now, I'm going to try and address a number of points made during the debate. Sue Webber talked about the need for fleet replacement. So the intercity trains are being procured. I announced on Friday that the Fife and Borders fleet will be procured, and also the suburban line. And to Sarah Black, they will be step-free in terms of her question about accessibility. Sue Webber also raised concerns about boom and bust in terms of rail investment. That's a criticism of the UK as a whole from the rail industry. What they say in Scotland is we've managed to have that steady investment that allows planning and to keep project teams together and to keep supply chains as well. Claire Baker raised the issue about the Fife Circle, and we had an exchange recently, and I think her point about measurement of short forming is a reasonable one, but again, hopefully, and she did welcome the investment for the stage of electrification and the battery electric fleet for that line. She and also others, including Katie Clark, raised issues around women's safety, which I and indeed my predecessors have taken very seriously. The travel safe teams have been expanded. The issues around ticket offices, the concern is actually about visibility of staff. There are more staff visible now on our railways than before. And one of the issues that I raised was about access and visibility from ticket offices to to platforms, and only 97% of those that were being impacted actually did have visibility. But the points raised by a number of people about CCTV, etc., needs to be communicated a bit further as well. I am concerned about the issues around British Transport Police, so if there's anything she can do with DFT's UK's department's cuts on that, I think that needs to be raised. But we're also working with our justice colleagues to look at other powers that might be available that might help some of the prosecutions, which I think people are keen to see, although the cases that are reported are being prosecuted. Mark Ruskell raised a number of points. He raised the issue around first-class services. I think currently the income is £8.5 million, so he may want to have a further discussion about what that means in terms of earning. But he's right in terms of looking at the commuter aspects, and they have been declassified, although I doubt many people know about that, so therefore that might be a point of communication that has to be addressed. He also raised the point, as did Richard Leonard, about looking at bonds, and in particular the proposal for green bonds. What I would say is the Scottish Government is continuing with the due diligence process in the work towards Scottish Government bonds, in line with the approach outlined in the 2025-26 Scottish Budget and the 2025 medium-term financial strategy. We have actually engaged with ASLIF. I think they underestimated savings, but what we have is a restriction on our borrowing. And obviously bonds would count against our borrowing, and our limits and our borrowing as a government is prohibitive. So that needs to be addressed as well. Jamie Green raised a number of points. He asked why I said it was unaffordable to extend the pilot. Now remember, the pilot was a pilot. Finlay Carson said it was a premature ending. No, it was extended twice. Once when the Greens were still in power and once when they had left government, and I extended it because I wanted to have it more time to be successful. But if anybody can remember, last summer there was a minor incident of an emergency budget when the UK government came into power, the new one, that caused major issues in terms of affordability. So I always said, and I said during the debates, and I really think the Tories in their motion have got a bit delusions of influence, but the point is that would funds became available to my budget, I would want to reintroduce them. And why? Because the certainty, I think, is the important thing. It's been gone and gone for good. Helps people to make decisions to switch, and that's where the modal shift will come from. He raises an important point about decarbonised transport generally, and that in terms of our climate change preparations, we'll be setting out a number of areas in transport. We're already securing different aspects in relation to HGV reductions and what we can do in that territory. So the more will come in relation to that issue. Others have raised issues. Douglas Lumsden raised, as others did, about different stations. Can I say for Cove and Newton Hill, Nestrans, and I would refer him to decisions that were made by Nestrans. There have been discussions between my officials and the Nestrans board, but the strategic business case is the next stage, and that's with the Nestrans board. Similarly, in terms of the passion we heard from others, Christine Graham, again, I want to pay tribute to her and her role in supporting the Borders Railway, and I look forward to joining her and indeed Borders Council tonight as we celebrate and the marking of the 2 years since the official opening of the Borders Railway. Emma Roddick talked about the Highlands, and I think she and also Finlay Carson made an important aspect. It's not always about population growth, which is mentioned in the Conservative motion, but actually identifying what can be done in other parts of Scotland. And indeed, I was on the Alness line recently in the far north, looking at the maintenance improvements there. That also leads me to the point by Richard Leonard. Oh no, after that miserable contribution, there's no way am I taking an intervention from Mr Gohani. However, Richard Leonard, I would say he needs to address the issues around the budget. And I have had exchanges with him, and indeed we have sat down with the RMT, because we've had a 34.9% increase in our rail infrastructure improvement rolling stock projects budget this year compared to last. The network infrastructure was down, but there was an issue around the IFRS capital cover for leasing stock. That will also impact on the UK government when they're trying to integrate rail and track and train, and also have public ownership. So that is an accounting issue, and in effect the rail capital budget did increase by £63.8 million. No, I want to make progress. So in terms of other areas, Kevin Stewart talked about the North East and the rail campaign there. He was right to do that, but everybody has demands. We want to continue to improve where we can. And in terms of other aspects of this, I want to come and bring my remarks to a conclusion. Yes, people always want to see improvement. In fact, Graham Simpson at least mentioned and recognised that we have got growing public satisfaction. We have got one of the best performance records compared to the rest of the UK, but there's more to be done. I also want to address the very important point that was made in relation to the campaign by Sight Scotland for companions. We've got the pilot that's happening just now. That's a very important part of what we're trying to do to ensure that blind companions can help support those that have needs in that area. I would encourage people to publicise that as well. In terms of where we go from here, we need investment, yes. We need to ensure that people understand that railways and transport investment is not just about services that provide a contractual arrangement from going from A to B. They are about communities, they are about resilience, they are about the economy. I would say in relation to freight that was referred to, we have reintroduced the rail freight grant because we've been able to do that this year. And no, I'm sorry, I really need to bring my remarks to a close. So we have ambitions for this railway. We have had the success of bringing together track and train in Scotland, but I have got remaining concerns about the rail reform bill because however much I appreciate, and I have meetings and will continue to meet with Lord Hendy, he has provided assurances he doesn't want to see that diminution, but until we see the legislation, that UK vertical integration has a real quandary and a real conundrum as to how it might apply to Scotland. So that's why I think it's a very important message that we can bring collectively, that we value our devolved responsibilities. And in supporting this motion today, it can meet both the challenge and indeed, prior to the introduction of UK Government's Railways Bill, send a strong signal, wholly in keeping with the efforts over the last 20 years, that Scotland's Railway is one that we are hugely proud of, and it should be afforded the power it needs to secure the best outcomes possible for the people and businesses of Scotland, and the improvements and the extension of services that the people of Scotland want, need and deserve.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on 20 years of Scotland's Railway, providing a strong platform for the future. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 18786 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to the business programme. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. And I call Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a Parliament, we have standing orders in place to support good governance. Therefore, the Scottish Conservatives intend to oppose this revision to the business programme, as it suspends the standing orders to subvert normal process, which I will expand on in tomorrow's LCM debate when this motion today inevitably passes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to respond on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau.
Thank you very much, President Officer. I think it's important that we place this amendment to business in its proper context. The report stage for the bill that the LCM relates to is in the House of Commons tomorrow. This LCM therefore requires expedited consideration by Parliament because the amendment that triggers the requirement for legislative consent has been tabled at this late stage in the bill's passage, and the UK Government is seeking assurances that the Scottish Parliament is granting its consent and will be secured before amending stages are complete. And the amendment is an important one because it helps to further our collective ambition to tackle climate change and facilitate the uptake of zero-emission buses. Given the bill is about to reach the last amending stage, I think it would be desirable for Parliament to consider whether its views can still influence the final form of the bill, and the only way to achieve this is to suspend standing orders so that the LCM can be taken in the Chamber without committee consideration. I can say, though, the committee's views were sought, and given the time constraints, its views were that varying standing orders to allow the LCM to be taken directly in the Chamber would be the best option. And if Parliament does not get the opportunity to debate the motion on legislative consent tomorrow, there is, of course, the risk that bill as amended proceeds to royal assent without this Parliament having had the opportunity to consider the matter and grant its consent. I think that's something I would imagine all parliamentarians, Mr Lumsden included, would want to avoid.
Thank you. The question is that motion 18786 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we will move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access digital voting.